Luizínacio Lula da Silva will be the country's next president, officials confirm after a long and bitter campaign between the former president and the far-right leader. It was a rejection of Jair Bolsonaro's far-right movement and his divisive for years in office. Voters in Brazil on Sunday ousted President Jair Bolsonaro. Brasilia. Voters in Brazil on Sunday ousted President Jair Bolsonaro after just one term and elected the leftist former President Luizínacio Lula da Silva to replace him. Election officials said a rebuke to Mr. Bolsonaro's far-right movement and his divisive for years in office. The victory completes a stunning political revival for Mr. da Silva, from the presidency to prison and back, that had once seemed unthinkable. It also ends Mr. Bolsonaro's turbulent time as the region's most powerful leader. For years, he attracted global attention for policies that accelerated the destruction of the Amazon rainforest and exacerbated the pandemic, which left nearly 700,000 dead in Brazil, while also becoming a major international figure of the far right for his brash attacks on the left, the media, and Brazil's democratic institutions. More recently, his efforts to undermine Brazil's election system drew particular concern at home and abroad, as well as worldwide attention to Sunday's vote as an important test for one of the world's largest democracies. Without evidence, the president has criticized the nation's electronic voting machines as rife with fraud and suggested he might not accept a loss, much like former President Donald J. Trump. Many of his supporters vowed to take to the streets at his command. The results on Sunday made clear that tens of millions of Brazilians had grown tired of his polarizing style and the frequent turmoil of his administration. It was the first time an incumbent president failed to win re-election in the 34 years of Brazil's modern democracy. Still, Mr. da Silva won with the narrowest margin of victory over that same period, signaling the deep divide that he will confront as president. He won 50.90% of the votes versus Mr. Bolsonaro's 49.10%, with 99.98% of the vote counted Sunday night. I will govern for 215 million Brazilians, and not just for those who voted for me, Mr. da Silva said in his victory speech Sunday night, reading from pages held by his new wife, whom he married this year. There are not two Brazils. We are one country, one people, one great nation. Mr. da Silva, 77, a former metal worker and union leader with a fifth-grade education, led Brazil during its boom in the first decade of the century, but he was later convicted on corruption charges after he left office and spent 580 days in prison. Last year, the Supreme Court threw out those convictions, ruling that the judge in his cases was biased, and voters rallied behind the man known simply as Lula. Mr. da Silva's election brings an end to a presidential race that was widely regarded as one of the most important votes in Latin America in decades, a match between perhaps Brazil's two biggest living political figures with starkly different visions to reverse the country's fortunes. His victory also pushes Brazil back to the left, extending a string of leftist victories across Latin America, fueled by a wave of anti-incumbent backlash. 6 of the region's 7 largest countries have now elected leftist leaders since 2018. Despite his victory, a sizable portion of Brazil's 217 million people still view Mr. Da Silva as corrupt because of the vast government kickback scheme uncovered years after he left office. And while his corruption convictions were nullified, Mr. Da Silva was never ruled innocent. Despite his victory, a sizable portion of Brazil's 217 million people still view Mr. Da Silva as corrupt because of the vast government kickback scheme uncovered years after he left office. And while his corruption convictions were nullified, Mr. Da Silva was never ruled innocent. Yet, amid those flaws, the strong opposition to Mr. Bolsonaro and his far-right movement was enough to carry Mr. Da Silva back to the presidency. He's not the solution to every problem, but he's our only hope, said Stefane Silva de Jesus, a 30-year-old librarian, after she cast her ballot for Mr. Da Silva in Rio de Janeiro. He is set to take office on Jan. 1. The election of Lula's and CIO Lula da Silva is a drastic shift back to the left for Brazil after 4 years of President Jair Bolsonaro's far-right administration, while the former leftist leader has vowed to re-establish harmony in the country. His specific plans have been vague. Mr. Da Silva's stump speech revolved around expanding services for the poor, including more social welfare payments, a higher minimum wage, and programs to feed and house more people. To pay for it, he said he would raise taxes on the rich, but also simply increase government spending. How much he will be able to implement is unclear. Mr. Bolsonaro's right-wing party holds the most seats in Congress, and a powerful centrist bloc controls both the House and Senate. The country faces worse economic conditions than during Mr. Da Silva's first administration, and the interventionist policies of Mr. Da Silva's hand-picked successor as president led Brazil into a recession in 2014 from which it has still not fully recovered. His election, however, will likely be good news for the health of the Amazon rainforest, which is vital to the fight against climate change. Mr. Bolsonaro championed industries that extract the forest resources while slashing funds and staffing for the agencies tasked with protecting it. As a result, deforestation soared during his administration. Mr. Da Silva has a much better track record on protecting the forest, reducing deforestation while president. He campaigned on a promise to eradicate illegal mining and logging, and said he would push farmers to use areas of the forest that had already been cleared. Mr. Da Silva's victory was in part thanks to a broad coalition from communists to centrists, as the Brazilian electorate sought stability after Mr. Bolsonaro's volatile term, which was marked by clashes with the courts, a pandemic that killed more people than anywhere but the United States, and frequent attacks on the left, the media, academics, health professionals, and the nation's democratic institutions. Mr. Bolsonaro, 67, has faced a variety of investigations in the Supreme Court and Congress, including for his statements attacking the election system, his handling of the pandemic, and his potential involvement in disinformation operations. So far, He has avoided any consequences from those probes, in part because of his immunity as president. After he leaves office on Jan. 1, those investigations could gain steam. Mr. Bolsonaro has also had much of his activity as president shielded from government transparency laws because his administration effectively classified many records for up to 100 years, including his vaccine status. Mr. Da Silva has vowed to declassify those records once president. When we lift the carpet, you're going to see the rot underneath, he said at Friday's debate. While the election is over, there remains the concern for the health of one of the world's biggest democracies. President Jair Bolsonaro has spent years attacking Brazil's democratic institutions, including a sustained effort to undermine its voting system, leading millions of Brazilians to lose. Now, much of the country is wondering, will he accept his defeat? Sunday's vote split this country of 217 million people nearly down the middle, with many voters on each side viewing the choice as an existential one for the nation. Far-right lawmakers who had warned of fraud in the past immediately recognized Mr. Da Silva as the president-elect. Prominent conservative pundits called Mr. Da Silva an ex-convict and corrupt, but did not claim the election was rigged, and many of Mr. Bolsonaro's supporters on the streets of Rio de Janeiro. I feel robbed. Yet, despite his suspicion that the election might have been stolen, he was preparing to head out. Now I'll go home, talk to my family, lean on God, and wait for Bolsonaro to say something, he said. Carla Zambelli, a far-right congresswoman who has warned, without evidence, of rigged elections for years, posted on Twitter on Sunday night that President-elect Lula da Silva, known as Lula, had won. The dream of freedom of more than 51 million Brazilians lives on, she wrote. In recent weeks, military leaders also said privately that they would not support any efforts by Mr. Bolsonaro to challenge the results. On Friday, in an interview after the final debate, Mr. Bolsonaro was asked directly whether he would accept the vote's results, regardless of outcome. There is no doubt, he said, whoever gets more votes takes it. That's democracy.